7 True Halloween Horror Stories. Story 1. The Halloween Party That Never Ended. Sarah loved Halloween more than anything in the world. Ever since she was a little girl, she had been obsessed with the holiday. The costumes, the decorations, the sense of magic and mystery that filled the air on October 31st. As a child, she would spend weeks planning her costumes and gathering decorations. She loved the way the world transformed on Halloween night. The ordinary became extraordinary. People became someone else. The boundary between the real and the imaginary seemed to blur and disappear. When Sarah grew up, that obsession never faded. If anything, it grew stronger. She read books about Halloween history. She studied different cultures' traditions around death and the supernatural. She joined online communities dedicated to discussing the holiday. By the time she was 35 years old, she had collected thousands of decorations. Her apartment was packed with them. She stored boxes of Halloween items in a rented storage unit downtown. When she finally bought the old farmhouse on the edge of town, she knew exactly what she would do with it. Every single Halloween, she would throw a party. Not just any party, but the biggest, most spectacular party the town had ever seen. A party so incredible that people would talk about it all year long. A party that would become legendary. This year was supposed to be her masterpiece. Sarah had spent the entire month of October preparing in obsessive detail. She began decorating in the first week of the month. She hung fake cobwebs from every corner of the house, carefully arranging them so they looked appropriately tattered and neglected. She placed plastic skeletons in the windows and hung them from the ceiling in various positions. Some hung by nooses, others had their arms raised as if reaching toward the sky. She set up fake tombstones in the front yard, carefully arranging them so they created a small cemetery effect. She strung orange and purple lights around the entire property, creating a warm, eerie glow that made the farmhouse look like something out of a Gothic novel. She even hired a professional decorator to create a haunted maze in her backyard using hay bales and painted cardboard cutouts. The maze was complex and disorienting, designed to take about 20 minutes to navigate. She stocked the kitchen with every type of Halloween candy imaginable. She made elaborate punch recipes she found in old cookbooks. She planned a playlist of horror movie soundtracks and spooky music. By early evening on Halloween night, Sarah was a nervous wreck. She was so excited about the party that she could barely eat. She put on her costume, an elaborate witch outfit that she had ordered from a specialty shop. It came with a proper pointed hat, a long black dress with patches and lace details, a gnarled wooden staff, and even a specially designed makeup kit that made her face look ancient and sinister. By 9 p.m. on Halloween night, about 40 people had crowded into her farmhouse. Some wore elaborate costumes that looked like they had been professionally made. Others wore simple masks they had picked up from the store at the last minute. Sarah had spent weeks perfecting her witch costume. Complete with a pointed hat and a broomstick, she had decorated herself with dried flowers and shells. A horror movie played on the big screen in the living room. The kitchen was filled with bowls of candy and punch. Multiple playlists of spooky music cycled through speakers set up throughout the house. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as Sarah had imagined it. But as the night progressed, Sarah began to notice something was deeply wrong. The party didn't feel right in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Everyone was quieter than they should have been. The conversations seemed forced and robotic, like people who didn't know what to say to each other. People danced to the music, but they moved in a strange, mechanical way, like puppets on strings. Their smiles looked painted on, artificial, as if they were wearing emotional masks as well as physical ones. They barely laughed even when funny things happened or when Sarah tried to tell jokes. Nobody seemed to be having any genuine fun. It was as if they were all going through the motions of enjoying themselves without actually feeling anything. Sarah felt her heart sinking. This was supposed to be the best party ever. This was supposed to be perfect. But something was very wrong. Sarah walked around the house frantically, greeting guests and trying to inject some energy and excitement into the party. She turned up the music. She offered people different drinks. She brought out special snacks and decorations. But when she tried to talk to people, they barely acknowledged her. They just stared ahead with blank, glassy eyes. It was as if they couldn't see her or hear her. They looked right through her like she was invisible. When she tried to grab someone's arm to get their attention, to draw them into conversation, her hand passed right through their shoulder. She felt nothing but cold air. Sarah's confusion turned to fear. She backed away from the guests and looked around the room more carefully. That was when she noticed the clock on the wall showed 9:17 p.m. She thought that was very odd, because it felt like she had been walking around for at least an hour, trying to enjoy her own party. She looked at the clock again to confirm. Still 9:17. She checked the clock in the kitchen. 9:17. The clock on the wall in the bedroom. 9:17, the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Frozen her. Every single clock in the house showed the exact same time, frozen in place. Sarah walked to the window with shaking hands and looked outside at the street. She watched a blue sedan drive slowly down the road in front of her house. The driver was a woman with red hair who gripped the steering wheel tightly. Sarah watched the car drive out of sight, disappearing behind the trees at the edge of her property. Then, exactly 30 seconds later, she saw the same blue sedan coming back down the road from the opposite direction. The same woman was driving with the same expression on her face. She passed the house again, not looking at it. And then, 30 seconds later, the car appeared again in the distance, about to drive in the first direction once more. The car kept appearing and disappearing, over and over again, always in the same position, always moving at the same speed, always with the same woman driving. It was as if someone had cut out a section of reality and was playing it on repeat like a movie scene looped endlessly. Sarah felt ice-cold fear spreading through her entire body like a disease. She looked down at her own hands. They were slightly transparent. She could see through them. She could see the skin on her hands becoming translucent, and she could see the wall behind her through her fingers. She waved her hand in front of her face, and she could barely see it move. When she looked in the mirror hanging on the wall, her reflection looked pale and distant, as if she was very far away, as if the mirror was showing her image from the other end of a very long tunnel. That was when the memories crashed into her consciousness like a massive wave. She remembered now. She had been driving to the store to buy more decorations and punch. She had forgotten something important for the party. She was driving down the highway, thinking about how excited she was for tonight. She was thinking about how amazing the party would be. She was thinking about what a success it would become. Then suddenly, in her peripheral vision, she saw the headlights of another car coming toward her. The other driver was drunk. He had crossed the line into her lane. She tried to swerve, but it was too late. The collision was massive and immediate. The collision happened at exactly 9:17 p.m. Sarah had died instantly. Her body had been torn apart in the crash. The party she was driving to buy supplies for never actually happened. She had created it in her mind, trapped in that moment between life and death, and she had been living it over and over again ever since, never quite realizing that she was already dead. The party never ended because she was frozen in time, doomed to repeat the same evening for eternity. The guests at the party were other spirits who had died the same way. They were all trapped in their own moments of death, forever replaying the decisions they had made just before they died. Some had been there for years. Some had been there for decades. They were all just shadows going through the motions, unable to truly live or truly leave. News of the farmhouse spread through the town. After multiple reports from people who claimed to have seen strange things happening inside the house at night, the local news investigated the property. Reporters found the farmhouse completely empty and abandoned. Dust covered every surface. Cobwebs hung in corners, but they were real cobwebs, not the fake ones Sarah had hung, but inside one of the drawers in the kitchen. They found an old invitation to a Halloween party dated exactly 30 years ago. The date and time matched perfectly. October 31st, 9:17 p.m. Every Halloween since then, neighbors and visitors to the property report the same phenomenon without fail. Through the windows of the farmhouse, they can see a full party happening inside, even though the house is completely empty. They can see about 40 people dancing and drinking and eating. They can see a woman dressed as a witch walking from person to person, greeting them even though her hand passes through them like mist. The clock always shows 9:17. The same song plays over and over on the stereo, never moving forward. The same blue sedan drives past on the road outside, again and again in its endless loop. And the guests never seem to move naturally. They just dance and stand and stare, like actors following a script they have performed 1,000,000 times before. Some people say that if you look carefully at the party through the window on Halloween night, you can see your own reflection among the guests. You can see yourself dancing, yourself smiling, yourself trapped in that moment forever. Those people never return to the farmhouse. They understand what they have seen. They understand that the party is still looking for more guests. It is always looking for more people to join it. And they know that one day, if they are not careful, they might find themselves at 9:17 p.m. on a road somewhere, making a fateful decision that will trap them there forever. Story 2. The Smiling Man in the Corn Maze. Jake had a tradition with his daughter Emma. Every fall, when the weather turned crisp and the leaves began to change color, they would go to Holloway's corn maze. It was the biggest corn maze in the state, stretching across 15 acres of farmland. The owners did an incredible job each year, cutting new and more complex paths through the tall corn. Families came from 3 states away to try to solve the maze. Jake had taken Emma since she was 5 years old. Now she was 10, and she had come to love the maze as much as he did. They had tried it every year, sometimes finding the exit quickly, sometimes getting hopelessly lost for hours. It was their special tradition, just the 2 of them against the maze. This year they decided to go on Halloween evening. The corn maze was especially crowded that night. Families dressed in costumes wandered through the paths, laughing and joking. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and pink. There was a cold wind blowing through the corn. Most people had left the maze by early evening, but Jake and Emma were still inside, determined to find the exit before dark. They had been walking through the maze for about an hour. Emma was getting tired and kept complaining that her feet hurt. The paths all looked the same to her. She asked Jake if they were lost. Jake said they weren't lost, they were just taking a different route. But truthfully, he wasn't sure anymore which direction they were going. Jake picked up Emma and carried her on his hip. She was getting too heavy to carry, but he did it anyway. He tried to stay calm and keep track of the turns they were making. Left, right, straight, left again. But the paths twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. It felt like the maze was intentionally confusing him, sending them in circles. That was when Jake first noticed the man. He was standing about 50 yards away at the intersection of 2 paths. He wore clothes that looked like they were from an old photograph, maybe from the 1950s or earlier. His skin was extremely pale, almost white, and he was smiling. But it wasn't a normal smile. His mouth stretched too wide across his face. His smile looked painted on like the smile of a doll or a mask. Jake's heart began to race. He didn't want to acknowledge what he was seeing. so he turned down a different path away from the man. He tried to walk faster. Emma asked him why he was walking so fast, but when he turned the next corner, the man was there again, still smiling that impossible smile, still staring directly at Jake. This time he was closer, maybe 30 yards away. His eyes were completely black, like someone had filled them with ink. Jake picked up his pace even more. He didn't want Emma to notice the man. He didn't want to scare her. He kept walking, taking random turns trying to find the exit as fast as possible. But no matter which way he turned, the man was always there. Sometimes he was behind them. Sometimes he was ahead of them. Sometimes he was standing silently to the side, just watching. Behind Jake, he could hear the sound of footsteps moving through the corn. The footsteps were getting closer. Jake started jogging. Emma asked him what was wrong. He said nothing was wrong, they were just in a hurry now. He could hear his own breathing becoming loud and panicked. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Jake's mind was racing. He tried to think rationally. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Maybe it was a Halloween prank. Maybe someone had hired an actor to scare people in the maze. But the man's smile looked wrong. Too wrong to be real makeup. And the man's eyes looked completely empty, like there was nothing behind them at all. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 more minutes, Jake saw lights ahead. The parking lot. The exit was right there. He ran toward it, not caring about the corn scratching his legs or Emma's complaints about the bumpy ride. He burst out of the maze and into the parking lot, his chest heaving with exertion and fear. The next morning, Jake couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. He decided to research the corn maze's history. He found some old newspaper articles in the library. To his horror, he discovered that 3 people had died in the corn maze over the past 40 years. The first was a man in 1961 who had gotten lost and died of exposure during the night. His body wasn't found for 3 days. The second was a man in 1987 who had simply vanished without a trace. No body was ever found, but his car was still in the parking lot. The third was a young girl in 1993 who had gone into the maze with her family and never came out. They found her body 3 days later, lying in the exact center of the maze, though nobody could figure out how she had gotten there or what had killed her. But the most disturbing detail was this. In all 3 cases, other visitors to the maze had reported seeing a man in old-fashioned clothes with an unnaturally wide smile and completely black eyes. He appeared in witness statements from 1961, 1987, and 1993, and many visitors over the years, decades apart, had reported seeing the same man on various nights in between. Jake never returned to the corn maze. He threw away his yearly tradition. He couldn't bear to go back there. But sometimes, on cold October nights, he wakes up in the middle of the night and sees a figure standing in his yard. The figure is tall and impossibly thin. Its skin is completely white. Its mouth is stretched into that same impossible smile. It never blinks and it never stops staring directly at Jake through the window. Jake has learned not to look back. Every time he does, the figure gets closer to the house, and he is terrified of what will happen if it ever reaches his front door. Story 3. The costume that wouldn't come off Mark worked as an accountant at a small firm in the city. His job was boring and repetitive, but it paid the bills. He had a small apartment, no girlfriend, and no real friends to speak of. He was the kind of person nobody noticed. He went to work, did his job, and went home. His life was as plain and gray as his suit, but Mark loved Halloween. It was the one night of the year when he could be someone else. He could wear a costume and pretend to be someone interesting, someone mysterious, someone dark and dangerous. So every year he would go to Halloween parties, always trying out a new costume. He had been a zombie, a serial killer, a vampire, and a ghost. But he had never found the perfect costume. the one that really felt like him. On October 15th, Mark decided to go thrift shopping. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was just browsing. He wandered through the racks of old clothes, looking at old dresses and faded shirts. Then he saw it. In a corner of the store, hanging on a single rack, was a devil costume. It was made of deep red fabric with black trim. It came with horns and a long tail. The price tag said $5. Mark pulled it off the rack and held it up. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to it. It seemed to call to him. When he tried it on in the fitting room, it fit perfectly. It was like the costume had been made specifically for his body. Every seam aligned perfectly with his shoulders and arms. The fit was too perfect to be coincidence. Mark bought the costume for $5 and took it home. He hung it in his closet and forgot about it until Halloween night. When October 31st arrived, he put on the devil costume. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The costume transformed him completely. He looked dark and dangerous and mysterious. He looked like someone people would notice. He looked like someone who mattered. That night, Mark went to a party. Everyone complimented his costume. They said it was the best costume they had ever seen. They asked him what special effects makeup he had used to make his eyes so dark and hollow. They wanted to know where he had gotten it. But Mark hadn't applied any makeup. The costume itself seemed to create the effect. His eyes looked sunken and black. His skin looked pale and corpse-like. But Mark hadn't done anything to create that appearance. It was all the costume. As the night progressed, Mark felt something changing inside him. It wasn't physical. It was more like something in his mind was waking up. He began to think dark thoughts. He found himself laughing at jokes that were cruel. He made comments that were mean and hurtful. He did things he would never normally do. He humiliated a shy girl by mocking her costume. He got into a fight with someone over a stupid comment. He made a girl cry by saying something deliberately hurtful about her appearance. But even as he was doing these things, a part of Mark's mind was screaming at him to stop. This wasn't him. This wasn't who he was. He was normally kind and quiet. But the costume seemed to be controlling him. It was like something else was inside the fabric, controlling his actions, making him do terrible things. When the party finally ended, Mark went home and tried to take off the costume. He reached for the zipper, but there was no zipper. He ran his hands over the seams of the costume, looking for any way to remove it. He couldn't find anything. He pulled and pulled, but the costume wouldn't budge. It was like the fabric had become part of his skin. Mark went to bed wearing the costume, thinking he would deal with it in the morning. But the next morning, the costume still wouldn't come off. He tried to cut it with scissors, but the scissors wouldn't cut the fabric. It was like trying to cut through metal. He went to the doctor's office in a panic, explaining that his costume was stuck to his body. The doctor examined him but found nothing. There was no zipper. There were no seams anymore. It was as if the costume had merged with his skin. The doctor had no idea how it was attached to his body. Blood tests showed nothing unusual. X-rays showed nothing. It was as though the costume had simply become part of him. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The costume remained stuck to Mark's body. He learned to live with it. He wore long sleeves and hid the red fabric under his clothes. But he could feel it on his skin, always there, always present. And his personality kept changing. Mark became cruel and aggressive. He started spending time in dark corners of the internet. He said things that would have horrified him before. He did things that violated his own values. He pushed away every friend he had. His co-workers began to notice the change. They said there was something deeply wrong with him. His boss called him into the office and told him he was being fired for his behavior and attitude. His girlfriend of 2 years left him. She said he had become a different person. She said there was something empty in his eyes now. like nobody was really there anymore. She said she felt afraid around him. After she left, Mark stopped trying to hide what was happening to him. He wore the costume openly with no shirt covering it. He didn't care what people thought anymore. Years passed. Mark still wears the costume. It is faded and torn in places, but he still can't remove it. He has stopped trying. The fabric is rotting now, hanging in shreds from his body, but it never fully tears away. He can feel something inside the costume, something that moves on its own, something that isn't him. On quiet nights, Mark can feel it crawling beneath the fabric like an insect. He wonders if the costume ever held the devil at all, or if the devil was just waiting for him to put on the costume so that it could crawl inside and take over his body. 3 weeks after Halloween night, when Mark first put on the costume, the thrift store where he had found it burned down. The fire happened at exactly 9:17 p.m., the exact same time Halloween night had ended. Nobody knew how the fire started. The firefighters who responded said it was the strangest fire they had ever seen. The flames were black instead of orange, like the fire itself was rotten from the inside. It seemed to spread against the direction of the wind, as if it was alive and searching for something. The building was completely destroyed. No trace of the costume stock remained, but Mark knew there were other costumes out there, hidden in thrift stores and antique shops around the country, waiting for someone else to find them and put them on. Story 4. The Children in the Graveyard. In a small town in Pennsylvania, there is a graveyard that locals warn people never to visit on Halloween night. Everyone in the town knows the story, but nobody can quite remember exactly how the tradition started or why it's true. All they know is that something happens in that graveyard every October 31st after dark. Something that nobody fully understands, but everyone fears. Officer Jackson had never believed the stories. When he first joined the police force, he thought the Halloween graveyard warnings were just local folklore, something the older generation had made up to scare kids. But after 3 years on the job, he had responded to so many calls from terrified residents on Halloween night that he began to believe there might be something real happening. Every single Halloween, without fail, at least 3 families would call the police with the same story. They would report seeing their dead children walking through the graveyard after sunset. Not their living children in costumes, but their actual dead children. Children who had died years ago. Children who were buried in that very graveyard. The parents would swear they recognized their own children, even if it had been many years since they had died. Jackson reviewed case files going back 2 decades. In every single year, families reported the same phenomenon, and in every single year, the children were back home in their beds by morning, completely unharmed and with no memory of what had happened. Their parents would find dirt under their fingernails and mud on their clothes. But when questioned, the children had no explanation for how the dirt got there. One year, Jackson decided to investigate one of these cases in detail. He spoke to a mother named Linda, who claimed to have seen her son in the graveyard. The boy had died 5 years earlier in a car accident. He was 7 years old when he died. Linda was absolutely certain that the boy she had seen in the graveyard was her son. She described his exact appearance in perfect detail, even the small scar above his eyebrow that he had gotten when he fell off his bike. Jackson looked up the boy's grave. It was in the graveyard, right where the mother said she had seen him. The grave was undisturbed. The ground around it showed no signs of being dug up. The grass was intact, but Jackson could see fresh dirt under the mother's fingernails. He could see dirt all over the front of her nightgown, the nightgown she had been wearing when she saw her son. Jackson's skepticism began to fade. He decided to stake out the graveyard on Halloween night. He parked his police car at the edge of the property and waited. He brought binoculars and a flashlight. He had a camera ready to document whatever he might see. At exactly 8:47 p.m., things began to change. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Jackson could see his own breath. He watched through his binoculars as children began to appear in the graveyard. They didn't walk into the graveyard. They simply materialized out of the darkness as if they were rising up out of the ground itself. There were dozens of them. Some wore clothes that looked modern, but others were dressed in clothing from different eras. Jackson could see children in clothes from the 1950s, the 1930s, the 1800s. Some of their clothes were rotting and falling apart. Some of their skin had the pale, waxy appearance of something that had been underground for a very long time. They didn't make any noise. They didn't speak or cry out. They simply stood among the gravestones, staring at nothing, waiting for something. Their eyes were completely hollow and empty. Jackson's fear was building, but his police training told him he needed to investigate. He stepped out of his car and began walking toward the graveyard. The moment his foot touched the ground inside the graveyard boundary, he felt something grab his ankle. It was ice cold and impossibly strong. He tried to move forward, but he couldn't. His leg was frozen in place. He shined his flashlight down at his ankle, but there was nothing there. No hands, no visible restraint, but the grip was strong enough that he couldn't move no matter how hard he pulled. He looked up and all the children had turned to face him. They were all staring directly at him with their hollow eyes. They didn't move toward him, but they didn't need to. The grip on his ankle was tightening. Jackson heard a sound that was like children singing, but in a language he didn't recognize. It was a horrible sound, like fingernails on a chalkboard mixed with the cry of an injured animal. The children's mouths weren't moving, but the sound was coming from them. It was coming from inside the earth itself. In that moment, Jackson understood what was happening. The children didn't want to hurt him. They wanted him to join them. They wanted him to stay in the graveyard forever. They were lonely. They had been waiting underground for so long, waiting for someone to come and fill the empty spaces where their friends used to be. Somehow, through sheer force of will, Jackson managed to break free. He doesn't remember exactly how. He just remembers pulling with all his strength and suddenly breaking free from the grip. His ankle felt like it was on fire. He didn't look back. He ran to his car and drove away, leaving deep tire tracks in the grass of the graveyard. Jackson never returned to that graveyard. He refuses to work on Halloween nights anymore. When his boss asked him why, he just said he was sick. He never explained what he had seen or experienced. But his colleagues noticed that something had changed in him. He became withdrawn and quiet. He started having panic attacks. He kept checking the windows of the police station, as if he was afraid something was watching him. Sometimes on quiet nights, Jackson can still feel that grip on his ankle. The pressure is usually light, almost like someone is just gently reminding him that they remember him. But on some nights, the grip tightens and Jackson feels like he is being pulled towards something he can't see. He looks out his window and sometimes he can see them standing in his yard. The children in their old-fashioned clothes staring at him with their hollow eyes, waiting. He wonders if the day will come when the grip on his ankle becomes too strong for him to resist. And he wonders if on that day, he will wake up in the graveyard among all those dead children, realizing that he never actually escaped at all. Story 5. The Haunted House on Maple Street. The old Victorian mansion on Maple Street had been sitting empty and abandoned for 15 years. Nobody lived in it. Nobody had lived in it since 1978, when the previous owner had been found dead in one of the upstairs bedrooms under circumstances that the police never fully explained. After his body was discovered, nobody wanted to buy the house. It was deemed cursed or haunted or just generally unlucky, so it sat empty year after year. Its paint peeling, its windows broken, its garden overgrown. But the house had become famous among teenagers in the area. Every Halloween, Groups of kids would dare each other to spend the night inside the haunted house on Maple Street. It was a rite of passage. If you could survive one night in the house, you were brave. You were tough. You had proven yourself. Some teenagers would last only an hour before running out screaming. Others would make it 2 or 3 hours before the fear became too much. But in all the years that teenagers had been going into that house, nobody had ever lasted the entire night. Nobody had ever seen the sun rise from inside that house. The longest anyone had lasted was 3 hours and 47 minutes. A group of 5 friends, all 17 years old, decided they would be different. They decided they would spend the entire night in the haunted house on Maple Street. Their names were Marcus, Daniel, Sarah, Jennifer, and Michael. They were the coolest kids at school, or at least they thought they were. They were confident and brave, or at least they pretended to be. They wanted to prove that the ghost story was just a myth. They brought flashlights, cameras to film evidence of ghosts, sleeping bags, and snacks. They were going to treat it like a camping trip. They were going to stay up all night, hang out, and prove that there was nothing scary about the house at all. They arrived at the house at around 8 in the evening on Halloween night. The sun was just setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. The house looked even more sinister in the fading light. The wooden boards nailed over the windows looked like skeletal fingers. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. The whole structure seemed to lean to one side as if it was tired of standing. The teenagers pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and rot and something else they couldn't quite identify, a sweet smell like flowers that had been left in a tomb for centuries. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating dust that floated in the beams like tiny ghosts. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. They explored the house, joking about the creaking sounds and the cold drafts. They went through the kitchen, the living room, the bedrooms. Everything was exactly what you would expect from an abandoned house. Furniture covered in white sheets, pictures hanging on the walls, their subjects staring down at them with empty eyes. Nothing scary, just empty and sad. But as midnight approached, things began to change. The teenagers started hearing footsteps in the rooms above them. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the sound of someone walking across the floor. But when they shined their flashlights and checked the rooms above them, they found them completely empty. There was nobody there, yet the footsteps continued, slow and methodical, crossing from one side of the room to the other. Then they heard children laughing. Not the happy laughter of kids playing, but something darker, a laughter that sounded cold and empty and wrong. It seemed to come from the kitchen, even though they were all standing in the living room. When they went to investigate, they found the kitchen empty and cold. But the laughter continued, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Sarah said they should leave. She said this wasn't fun anymore. She was scared, but Marcus said they had only been there for 3 hours. They needed to stay longer. They needed to prove they could do it. The other boys agreed with Marcus. Jennifer tried to support Sarah, but she was outnumbered. They decided to stay. Then Michael saw the first shadow. It moved across the wall of the living room in a smooth, gliding motion. It looked like a man, he said, a tall man with broad shoulders. But it had no face. Where the head should have been, there was just darkness, a blank void. They spun their flashlights around, trying to find the source of the shadow. But there was no light that could be creating it. The shadow simply existed on the wall, moving on its own, independent of any light source. And as they watched, frozen in place, the shadow became more detailed. They could see the outline of a face forming in the darkness. A terrible face with an expression of pure rage. More shadows began to appear on the walls. A woman with long, stringy hair and empty eye sockets. Children with twisted, wrong bodies. An old man with bones showing through his skin. An entire collection of twisted, horrible shapes that shouldn't exist. And they began to make sounds. Not screaming exactly, but something worse. A sound like breathing mixed with crying, mixed with something that hurt to listen to. The sound of people in terrible pain. The sound of suffering without end. Marcus tried to run for the door, but he found it locked. He pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Jennifer and Sarah were screaming. Daniel was crying. Michael was frozen in place, staring at the shadows on the wall. They were completely surrounded. The shadows were coming from every direction, closing in, getting closer. By 3:15 a.m., the teenagers couldn't take it anymore. 4 of them forced the door open by ramming it with their shoulders. They ran out of the house and ran down the street. They ran until they couldn't run anymore. Then they got in Marcus's car and drove away from the house as fast as they could. But David wasn't with them. David was still inside the house. They called the police from Marcus's car. They were hysterical. They reported that their friend was still inside the house. Police officers responded to the call, arriving at the old Victorian mansion on Maple Street at around 3:45 a.m. They entered the house with their weapons drawn, expecting to find David trapped or injured, but the house was completely empty. There was no sign of David anywhere. They searched every room, every closet, every corner of the house. It was as if David had never existed, as if he had never been there at all. The only strange thing they found was this. In the center of the master bedroom on the second floor, there was a small circle of fresh dirt on the hardwood floor. It looked like someone had dug a small hole and then covered it back up, but there was nothing in the hole. It was completely empty. David was never found. His body was never discovered. It was as if he had vanished without a trace, taken into another dimension or buried alive in that house by something that existed outside the normal rules of reality. The other 4 teenagers never talked about what happened that night. They refused to speak to police. They refused to go back to school. They eventually moved away from the town and never returned. But every Halloween since then, teenagers in that town report the same thing. When they get close to the haunted house on Maple Street, they can hear screaming coming from inside. They can see shadows moving behind the boarded-up windows. And sometimes, if they look carefully through the cracks in the boards, they can see a young man sitting in the center of the master bedroom, staring straight ahead with a blank expression on his face. He looks exactly like David, but his skin is gray and he doesn't move or blink or acknowledge anyone watching him. And locals say that every year on Halloween, a new teenager goes into that house and one fewer teenager comes out. Story 6. The Halloween masks from the antique store. Rebecca had always loved masks. Ever since she was a child, she had been fascinated by them. Masks from different countries and different time periods. Phoenician masks with their elaborate feathers and gold paint. African masks with their geometric patterns and carved details. Japanese masks with their subtle expressions. She collected them, hanging them on the walls of her apartment, studying them, sometimes trying them on when nobody was watching. When she inherited her grandmother's house, she was thrilled to discover an entire room filled with antique masks. Her grandmother had been a collector too, though Rebecca had never known this about her. The masks hung on every wall, stacked on shelves, stored carefully in boxes. There were hundreds of them, thousands maybe. Rebecca decided to set up the room as her personal mask museum. She spent weeks cataloging them, cleaning them, arranging them by era and origin. But there was one mask that fascinated her more than all the others. It was made of pale wood, almost bone-white in color. It depicted a beautiful woman's face with elegant features and a serene expression. But there was something strange about it. The eyes were too dark. They seemed to look straight through you, as if the mask could see into your soul. According to the label attached to it, the mask was from the 1800s and came from somewhere in Eastern Europe. No country was specified. The origin was simply listed as unknown. Rebecca became obsessed with this mask. She would spend hours in the mask room just looking at it. She would hold it in her hands and stare at the beautiful, serene face. She would try it on, standing in front of the mirror, marveling at how perfectly it fit her face. It was like it had been made specifically for her. One day, a week before Halloween, Rebecca's friend Jennifer came to visit. Jennifer was concerned about Rebecca. She hadn't seen her in months. Rebecca had stopped going out. She had stopped answering calls. She had become completely withdrawn. When Jennifer entered the house, she could feel that something was wrong. The air felt cold and heavy. Rebecca showed Jennifer the mask room. Jennifer was impressed by the collection at first, but then she noticed that Rebecca was behaving strangely. Rebecca kept staring at the pale wooden mask with the dark eyes. Jennifer asked Rebecca if she was okay. Rebecca didn't answer. She just kept staring at the mask. Then Jennifer did something that Rebecca couldn't forgive. She made a joke about the mask. She said it looked creepy and that she didn't understand why Rebecca would want it. She said the eyes were dead and empty. She said looking at it made her uncomfortable. Rebecca became angry. She had never been angry before. She had always been gentle and kind, but now she felt rage filling her body. She told Jennifer to leave the house. When Jennifer tried to comfort her, Rebecca pushed her out the door and locked it. Jennifer was shocked. She called Rebecca's phone repeatedly, but Rebecca didn't answer. That night, Rebecca did something she couldn't explain. She took the pale wooden mask off the wall. She brought it to her bedroom, and she put it on her face. She fell asleep wearing the mask. When Rebecca woke up the next morning, the mask was stuck to her face. She couldn't remove it. She pulled and pulled, but it wouldn't come off. She tried using soap and water to loosen the fit, but nothing worked. She called her doctor, but they had no explanation. They recommended she go to the emergency room, but Rebecca refused. She didn't want anyone to know about the mask. Over the next week, Rebecca began to change. Or perhaps something inside the mask began to change her. She felt emotions that weren't her own: rage, hunger, a desire to hurt people, a desire to make others feel pain. She would sit in her mask room, staring at the other masks on the walls, and she would feel them calling to her. They wanted to be worn. They wanted to find new faces. They wanted to spread. By the time Halloween arrived, Rebecca had made a decision. She had taken down every mask from the walls and boxes. She had carefully wrapped them all in tissue paper and ribbon. She had placed them in bags and boxes, and she had driven to the antique mall downtown, the one where her grandmother had shopped for decades. She donated all of the masks to the antique mall. The owner was thrilled. He carefully unwrapped each one and arranged them in the display cases. He took photographs and posted them online. He advertised them as a rare collection from an estate sale. Collectors from around the world began calling, wanting to buy individual masks. People came from other cities to visit the antique mall specifically to see the collection. Rebecca was still wearing the pale wooden mask. She couldn't remove it. She had tried everything, but she could feel something different now. The mask wasn't controlling her anymore. Or rather, she and the mask had become one. She could see through the mask's eyes as clearly as if it wasn't there. She could feel the mask's emotions and desires as if they were her own. And she understood what was happening. The masks were old. Very old. They had been collecting themselves for centuries, spreading through antique stores and collectors' homes around the world. Each mask was waiting for someone to put it on, and when they did, the person and the mask would merge. The person would keep their life, their job, their family, but they would never be able to remove the mask. And they would feel the constant pull to spread the other masks to other people. Rebecca was the 20th person in her family line to be chosen by the masks. Her grandmother had been wearing a mask her entire adult life. Her great-grandmother before her, on and on going back centuries. They were all slaves to the masks now, spreading them around the world through antique stores and estate sales and collectors' auctions. By the end of October, 12 people had purchased masks from the antique mall. Rebecca knew this because she could feel them. She could sense where they were. She could feel the masks taking hold of their faces, spreading through their skin, becoming one with their bodies. And she could feel them understanding, just like she had, that they would never be free again, that they were now part of something much older and much more terrible than themselves. 1 year later, the police found Rebecca's house completely empty. She had left everything behind. A note on the kitchen table said only this: "I have gone to spread the collection. There are many more masks waiting to find their owners." They never found Rebecca, but there are reports from antique stores around the world of a woman who appears suddenly with a bag full of beautiful antique masks. She donates them, then disappears. Nobody has ever seen her face because she always wears a pale wooden mask with dark, empty eyes. And every Halloween, people report seeing masked figures moving through antique stores and estate sales. They are always wearing beautiful masks from different countries and different time periods. They are always arranging the masks in the display cases. And sometimes, if you look closely, you can see that the masks aren't covering their faces anymore. The masks and the people have merged completely. The masks are their faces now. Story 7. The Night the Trick-or-Treaters Never Came Home. Thomas and Margaret lived on a quiet suburban street in Ohio. They were in their 60s and had lived in the same house for 40 years. They had raised their children there. They had watched their children grow up and move away. They had become grandparents and then great-grandparents. The house was quiet now most of the time, but Thomas loved Halloween. Every year he and Margaret would decorate the house. They would fill a large bowl with candy and sit on the porch, handing out treats to the trick-or-treaters who came by. It was one of the highlights of their year, seeing the children dressed up in their costumes, hearing their excitement, watching them run from house to house collecting candy. It made Thomas feel young again, even though his knees hurt and his heart wasn't as strong as it used to be. This Halloween was supposed to be special. Their grandson was going trick-or-treating for the first time. He was 5 years old and dressed as a superhero. Thomas and Margaret had invited him to go with them as they walked around the neighborhood handing out candy. But something strange happened that night. By 8 o'clock, not a single trick-or-treater had come to their house. Thomas sat on the porch with the large bowl of candy, waiting. He waited for an hour, 2 hours. Nothing, no children, no one at all. Margaret was confused. Usually they would have hundreds of children come through the neighborhood. The street would be crowded. There would be groups of kids with their parents everywhere. But tonight the street was completely empty. It was like the entire town had disappeared. Thomas decided to take a walk. He wanted to see what was happening in the rest of the neighborhood. He grabbed a flashlight and walked down the street. Margaret stayed at the house with their grandson, who was upstairs watching television, completely unaware that anything was wrong. As Thomas walked, he noticed that the neighborhood looked different. The houses all had their porch lights on, but no decorations. No fake skeletons or tombstones or orange lights. Most houses looked completely normal, as if it wasn't Halloween at all. And there were no children anywhere. The street was deserted. Thomas walked for several blocks. The neighborhood looked the same everywhere he went. Empty, quiet, wrong. He tried to remember where the other trick-or-treaters would usually be at this time, but he couldn't think. His memory felt foggy. He couldn't remember the names of his neighbors. He couldn't remember the street names. He couldn't even remember why he had come out to walk. He turned to go home, but he couldn't remember which way was home. All the streets looked the same. All the houses looked the same. He was completely disoriented. He walked down one street and then another, trying to find something familiar. But everything looked wrong. The houses were too dark. The trees seemed wrong. The sky was the wrong color. After walking for what felt like hours, Thomas finally saw something familiar. His own house. The lights were still on. He went inside, relieved to be home. Margaret was sitting on the couch watching television. She didn't acknowledge him when he came inside. She just stared at the screen with a blank expression on her face. Thomas asked her where their grandson was. Margaret didn't answer. She just kept staring at the television. Thomas went upstairs to the guest bedroom where their grandson should have been. But the room was empty. The television was off. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there. Thomas went back downstairs and shook Margaret. He asked her where their grandson had gone. Margaret turned to look at him, and her eyes were completely empty. She had the same blank, lifeless expression as the people at the Halloween party had. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. That was when Thomas realized something terrible. He couldn't remember his grandson's face. He couldn't remember his name. He couldn't even remember why he thought a grandson had been there. Margaret was staring at him with that empty expression, waiting for something. And Thomas understood that she couldn't remember either. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Margaret tried to understand what was happening. They called their children, but their children didn't answer. They found it difficult to remember their children's names or their faces. They tried to look at photographs, but the photographs seemed to be empty. The people in the pictures were blurred and indistinct. Thomas discovered something in the local newspaper. An article from 50 years earlier reported that on Halloween night 1974, several children had gone missing from this exact neighborhood. They had been trick-or-treating and had simply vanished. The police had searched extensively, but no bodies were ever found. No ransom notes. No explanations. The children had simply disappeared. Over the years, more children disappeared on Halloween from the same neighborhood. It happened in 1980, then 1985, then 1991, then 1998, then 2005. Always on Halloween. Always children who were out trick-or-treating. Always in the same neighborhood. The police eventually stopped responding to trick-or-treating related reports in that area. Thomas began to realize the truth. The children weren't disappearing. They were being replaced. For every child who went missing on Halloween, the neighborhood added one more empty house. One more couple or family who lived in a house but who couldn't remember each other, who had no real relationships, who existed but weren't really alive anymore. Thomas tried to warn people. He wrote letters to the police. He called the newspaper. But nobody believed him. They told him he was an old man who was confused. They told him he should go see a doctor about his memory problems. But Thomas knew the truth. The neighborhood was slowly replacing itself, person by person, year by year. The real people were disappearing, and they were being replaced by empty shells who looked human but had nothing inside them. Empty vessels waiting to be filled with something else. Something that was slowly spreading through the neighborhood, taking over, one Halloween at a time. Every Halloween now, Thomas sits on his porch with a bowl of candy, waiting. He waits for trick-or-treaters who never come. He waits for his memories to return. He waits for his wife to look at him with recognition. He waits for something that will break whatever spell has been cast over this place. But nothing ever changes. The street remains empty. The houses remain dark. The people who live here go through the motions of being alive. But they are hollow and empty inside. And every Halloween, Thomas wonders if this year will be the year when he finally becomes completely empty too, when he will forget his own name, when he will forget that he was ever human at all,